have you ever asked yourself what it would look like if you turn a melee into a shotgun? Yeah, me neither. But anyway, the Quassus Prime would probably be the best answer, and it is really darn cool and unique. So today, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about it, how it works, how to play it, and of course, I have builds. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now with that being said, let's jump right into it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and first of all talk about what the Quassus Prime even is. The Quassus Prime, aka the newest melee weapon introduced in the game with the Zaku Prime access, is a Warframe type of melee weapon, and that means it has access to two different stance mods, those being the old Slice and Feathers and the quote-unquote new Votive Onslaught, but also this one is I think 3 years old or so. To make it very short, in the community, Votive Onslaught is generally perceived as the better choice if you want to play a Warframe into a standard melee playstyle, and when it comes to heavy attacks, both of these stances do exactly the same thing, so go with whatever you like. But yeah, speaking about heavy attacks, this nicely introduces us to the next big point on the list, and that will be that the Quassus Prime has a very unique role that not a lot of melees can fill. Let me elaborate on what exactly I mean here. When you're going up against larger crowds of enemies, even if you all group them tightly together in one blob, there is one problem that most melee weapons in the game always have, and that is the problem of the follow-through stat. What follow-through means is that the first enemy that is touched by the blade whenever you perform a melee attack will of course take the full damage. However, if the melee goes through multiple bodies, then every subsequent body will only take a certain percentage of the original damage, and that stacks with every body hit. So for example, if we have a follow-through value of 50%, that means the first body will take the entire damage, the second body hit with the same swing will only take half of that, the third one will only take half of that, and so on and so forth, meaning that even with the strongest melee weapons out there, the utmost damage nukes, if you pull together like 20 enemies in one blob and hit them all with one strike, then chances are pretty good that most of them will still survive, and there's only a very select few melee weapons in the game that have a 100% follow through and therefore could slice through everything equally. But now you might wonder, what exactly does this mean for the Quassus Prime? See, the Quassus Prime has one very unique feature, and that is if you perform a heavy attack, then you shoot out a bunch of daggers in a cone in front of you, to be precise 18 on the first heavy attack and 9 on the second heavy attack in the same combo, and all of those daggers have a guaranteed slash proc as well as an innate 2-meter punch through. What that means is that the way that you ideally use the Quassus Prime is not like your standard melee where you're actually, meleeing the enemies, but rather spamming those heavy attacks, throwing out tons and tons of those daggers, which will not only hit enemies further away from you and therefore be somewhat of a ranged quote-unquote melee weapon, and the fact that you're throwing out like 18 force slash procs on a heavy attack, well, that's certainly also nothing to scoff at. That's what I meant when I said that this is mainly a weapon to thin out larger crowds of enemies at a distance, but you can also use it as a nuke against tougher damage sponge targets by running up straight in front of them and then doing the heavy attack, because that means all those daggers will be forced into that one target, forcing so many slashes that the bleed ticks will be absolutely insane. One thing that also means is that, due to the fact that we have ranged attack projectiles, this weapon makes it relatively easy, compared to other melees, to headshot enemies. Yes, that's right, melee weapons in Warframe can headshot, but generally it is very darn difficult and inconsistent to hit those headshots, and with the Quassus Prime, you could actually aim a little bit higher and deal some extra damage, so that is definitely something to keep in mind. But you know what, that all might have sounded a little bit confusing. How about we first take a look at the actual weapon stats to get a better understanding of how exactly this is supposed to work. First off, as I just said, while of course you can play this weapon like a normal melee weapon into a light attack combo, there are also a fragillion other weapons in the game that do the same thing, they just do it all better. So when you want to go for the Quassus Prime, then you gotta go for it for this dagger throwing feature. The critical chance is very high with a base 35% at a 2.5x multiplier, so that is great crit values. The status chance is at 18%, which is not terrible, but compared to most other melee weapons, not really all that great either. A further reason why you would probably not want to play it like a standard melee. And what's even more interesting is that the status chance per projectile, per dagger that we're shooting out, is only 2%, so we're really relying on those force procs, and we do not expect to trigger anything else with the daggers. Oh yeah, and like we also did in my recent Trumna video, let's also compare the standard Quassus to the Prime in terms of stats to see in which ways it has improved. And here we see stat improvements overall. We have more crit chance, more crit damage, more status chance, more damage, basically more everything, which is generally nice, but it's not like it completely reinvents the weapon. The normal Quassus were already pretty nice. Oh yeah, and if you could maybe consider leaving the video a like, that would be super nice because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But now that we know all the intricate details on what the Quassus Prime could do and how to best use it, let's talk about the one thing that you're probably here for, that being the build section. And just like with the Trumna Prime, also here I would like to start out with what ideally not to do on the build before we get into what the build itself looks like. The first thing that on the Quassus Prime doesn't really make a lot of sense, even though every other melee weapon in the game loves it, would be our favorite arcane, melee influence. Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain what exactly melee influence does. Just in case you've never heard of it, it kind of makes it that elemental status effects that are on your weapon will be spread to enemies in the room, which allows you to pretty much nuke away everything with every melee weapon in the game. However, due to the fact that the Quassus Prime has only 2% status chance on the daggers, we're not going to trigger melee influence, which allows us to build this melee a little bit different than all the 99 others that we have in our arsenal. The next thing we don't want to use, which is also an arcane, would be melee afflictions. What this one does is, when an enemy is affected by a status effect and then they get either flung up into the air or knocked down to the ground, then these status effects will receive 6 additional instances. Now, when we look at the heavy attack from our stance mod, then we see that actually it knocks enemies down, which might lead you to think that this is pretty good, right? I mean, this was precisely the tactic that we used on the Harmony to turn it into the best heavy attack melee weapon in the game, so why shouldn't we use it here? Well, it's pretty simple. There are 2 reasons. The first one being that the knockdown only happens if you actually physically touch the enemy with a heavy attack. And secondly, because of the fact that every individual dagger will force a slash anyway, you don't gain all that much if you just get 6 on top. But now that we know how the Quassus Prime work and what not to do on it, let's finally talk about how to actually build the darn thing. And when it comes to that, I have 2 variations of kind of the same build prepared for you today. One is a melee duplicate build that makes sure we only deal yellow crits, so we can use melee duplicate to double those hits. And the other one allows us to go into higher crit tiers. For example, if you want to play it with Colorvo and go for the red crits, when melee duplicate wouldn't work. That is the second variation of the build that we're also going to take a look at later. But for now, let's start out with the melee duplicate one. First and foremost, of course, we go for melee duplicate, which at the max rank gives you a 100% chance that yellow crits will hit twice, meaning dealing twice the damage and also inflicting twice the status proc, which is very nice for the 18 force proc slashes on heavy attack, then 36. As it stands, it doesn't matter at all because we're playing it purely into heavy attacks and the heavy attack is the same on both fan stances. And as we delve into the mods, it becomes a little bit more interesting. First of all, for the crit chance, we go for Galvanized Steel, but not at max rank, only at rank 8. At rank 8, this mod gives us plus 90% crit chance, or times 2 that on heavy attack, so 180% for this build, as well as 24.5% more crit damage, stacking up to 4 times, so with this one, we're kinda sort of getting plus 100% crit damage. The reason why we don't want to max out this mod is that if we go beyond rank 8, that means our final crit chance will end up being above 100%, meaning we are going to see consistent orange crits, and on orange crits, melee duplicate won't trigger, therefore we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. If you wanted to, you could also make it rank 9, then you would have 105% crit chance. The sweet spot is somewhere in between, just don't go all the way up to rank 10. So much for the crit chance. When it comes to crit damage, we go for Organ Shatter, which is the normal version, not the Amalgam one, and the reason for that is that the Amalgam one has 5% less crit damage but therefore heavy attack wind-up speed, which first of all would make perfect sense because we are heavy attacking, but as you're going to see here in a minute, we have already more than enough heavy attack wind-up speed, which is the reason why we're going to go for the normal one, having that little bit more crit damage. For our base damage, I personally went for Prime Pressure Point. However, if you're using a primer, no matter if this is a companion, a weapon, or whatever, as long as you can ensure that you're going to have more than 3 different status types on the enemy, then you would go for Condition Overload. If not, then you just go for Prime Pressure Point. Then we go for even more base damage with Killing Blow, which is also the first source of heavy attack wind-up speed, so that's nice. Prime Fury to get even more attack speed, which is quite important because the Quassus Prime is more on the slow side of things, and just because I know there have been questions in the past, yes, even on heavy attack, wind-up speed is not the only thing that matters. Every heavy attack in Warframe is subdivided into 2 animation parts. The first one is the wind-up, and then the second one is the execution or the recovery, no matter how you want to call it. To speed up the wind-up, you need heavy attack wind-up speed, but as soon as you transition into the execution or recovery phase, that then will be influenced by your standard melee attack speed. Therefore, if you want to have the fastest heavy attacks possible, then you gotta make sure to both increase the wind-up as well as also the normal attack speed. Next, because most of our damage is going to come from the damage over time caused by all the force proc slashes that we're going to deal, we're going to go for Melee Elementalist, which gives us more status damage, and another 60% heavy attack wind-up speed. Just by the way, also with the Elementalist mod, we're not going to go for the Galvanized version of it, because while more status chance is definitely nice and the one that you want to go for on most melees out there, because of the fact that we're only going for the Dagger Throw, and the Dagger Throw have force proc slashes and beyond that only 2% status chance, that means the additional status chance doesn't really help us at all here, and it's just better to go for the wind-up speed with the normal version of the Elementalist. Up next, you know the drill, whoever says Elementalist also needs to say Primed Faction mod because faction damage double dips on damage over time effects, making them very strong and potent. So slap on whatever faction mod you need against the enemies you're up against, and the final mod in this build is going to be Galvanized Reflex. The most important part about it is the second one, giving you plus 20 initial combo, stacking up to 4 times, which means you can be at a constant 5x combo multiplier that doesn't go down any further beyond that. Why do we need that? Because whenever you perform a heavy attack, the damage of that heavy attack is going to be multiplied by your current combo multiplier, meaning with Galvanized Reflex on and a 5 times multiplier, this means we're going to deal 5 times the damage, and that is surely something we don't want to miss out on. If you wanted to, you could also go for an Exilus mod, but I don't think we really need it because of the fact that we're not going to do light attack. That means we're also not going to use Tennokai here, so the only Exilus mod that in my opinion would kind of make sense would be Dispatch Overdrive to give us a bit more movement speed, but you know, that is up to personal preference. If you like it, definitely go for it. If not, then well, you can save a forma. This right here then would be the full melee duplicate build, and just so we don't waste too much time, right here you already have the full version of the alternative build that doesn't go for melee duplicate. Only things we switch out here is, instead of galvanized steel, we go for sacrificial steel to amp up our crit chance as much as possible, because now we're not going to go for melee duplicate anymore, which means we don't have to force the crits down into the yellow area. We can go as high as possible, which is further reinforced by melee crescendo that can amp up your crit multiplier all the way to 12x. The only debatable thing on this build here would be Reflex Coil. If you use it, that gives you heavy attack efficiency, meaning you don't lose all your combo multiplier at once. So with this, you can get more out of your melee crescendo because it doesn't have to count up all the way from 0 with every hit. You know, it starts a little bit higher up. But of course, this always comes down to your personal playstyle, and if you wanted to, you could drop it out and replace it with Condition Overload, which gives you even more base damage, and it might be the better option. So you can treat the last mod slot right here a bit more as a flex slot. But before you click away, there is one more chapter to this video, and that would be synergies, you know, the stuff that you might want to consider using together with the Quassus Prime. And here I want to keep it a little bit short, so strap in. First of all, of course, All the usual stuff that always works great together with any melee weapon also works here. You know, Kalervo's Wrathful Advance for the red crit build, or Varuna, or literally any other melee frame out there. A Warframe or Companion that has a grouping ability works very, very good with this one because you're throwing out this cone of daggers and they have punch through, so if you throw it in a blob of enemies, that's gonna inflict a lot of slashes and lets them all bleed down. It's really cool. Also, Neja with his Divine Retribution augment, always great, works perfectly, you can nuke away rooms full of enemies. And this one might not be all that meta, but it is tons and tons of fun, would be Mirage with her 4 mirror clones. Remember, with the melee duplicate build, we were throwing out 18 daggers on the first heavy hit, where because of melee duplicate, each and every one of those daggers inflicted 2 hits, meaning 36 slashes. And now imagine not only you being the one throwing the daggers, but you plus your mirror images throwing the daggers. There are gonna be so many daggers thrown at the enemies, they're just gonna run into a wall of carnage, and even though it's probably not the best and most min-maxed way to play this weapon, you should absolutely try it out because it is tons and tons of fun. But what do you like with your Quassus Prime? Let me know in the comments down below. The Quassus are not the only new Prime weapon though. Also, the Trumna Prime is absolutely amazing, so don't miss out my guide on it right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Ondakanio2, Pepperwolf, Screamjet21, Signup King 5000, Mihawk HE, Yagis, Hoke Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.